Let's talk about trust, have a conversation about trust. It's something I've been musing on the last few days. And the kind of point of inspiration for throwing this around my brain space came from a Facebook post that I was reading last week. And the initial person who posted it was asking about nerves, and it was this big general question of like, how do I overcome nerves with my horse? And when I see a question like that, ironically, I always get a little bit stuck in the first instance, because to me, a question like that is only the start point to ask more beautiful, more curious questions of ourselves. You know, where has this energy come from? What has motivated this feeling? Is this relevant for the moment? And so on and so forth. And so, of course, there's lots of different pieces of advice given underneath this particular person's post. And one of them was a question posed back to her about, well, do you trust your horse? Because if you don't trust your horse, then it would make sense that you feel nervous, and so on and so forth. And this kind of dialogue opened up about trust. And I find it to be such an interesting thing, because as humans, we have quite an intimate relationship with trust. We see it as something that's very important to extend to each other, to feel in relationship to each other. But it's also something that is quite black and white for us, or where we might find ourselves sitting in this like interstitial territory where we kind of wonder whether that's something that we can extend to someone else. So it's either I have trust or I don't have trust. I don't trust you or I do trust you. There's these two polarities that we camp in, or we find ourselves in this middle ground where we're like, I'm not sure whether I can trust you yet. And so what I've been thinking about is, what is the opposite of trust, right? What is the opposite of trust? And if I think about extending trust to someone or something, oftentimes what happens is we find ourselves going through a set of criteria or a set of experiences which then tell us whether this person or this being that we're in this relationship in is worthy of our trust, right? So it's like an experience of proof gathering and proof showing from the other side. And I might sit here kind of like squinting and considering and not fully offering myself, not fully stepping into the full vulnerability of who I am, not opening myself up to the relationship in a complete sense. And if I'm sitting in a lack of trust or a wondering about trust, there's a reservedness about me, there's a holding back. If I think about how that shows up in the body, I'm contracted in some way. If a lack of trust or a consideration of trust is still there, there's a sucking back, a closeting, a guarding of my heart and my soft center, an armoring, if you like. So while I haven't come up with a word for what is the opposite of trust yet, I can sense how that shows up for me, right? If we move on to another example then, and I think about what it means to be on the other side of that equation, or how it feels to be on the other side of that equation, where I feel like I'm not trusted for some reason. And I think all of us will have had an experience with what we would consider to be an unfair lack of trust, where there's something on the other side where this person or that we're in relationship with, we sense doesn't trust us, right? And if you can just drop yourself into that experience for a moment and think about what it feels like not to be trusted, or to feel like you need to prove yourself to someone else in order to be worthy of being trusted. It creates as well a contraction, a kind of polarization. And so the flip of that, I guess, is, what rules do you have around extending trust to something or someone else? And you may not have thought about this before, because a lot of what I'm talking about is an unconscious dance, right? But what rules do you have? What does it take for you to feel like you can trust someone? Do you automatically extend trust, or is that something that comes after the fact? Yeah. And how do all of these experiences show up in your body, right? So that's kind of one of the first inquiries that I want to sit with. Then if we can move over to thinking about our beautiful horses and what is essentially a completely different relationship with trust, meaning that trust is not binary in their world. It is dynamic. It is interrelational, meaning that it's coming through lots of different forces and experiences. It's a process of constant and consistent communication. And it's an expression of safety. Siri has just fired up on my computer for some reason. It's an expression of safety. So in a herd situation, what we see is the members of the herd all grazing, and what they're experiencing between them is a communication happening on a visceral level, on a physical level, on a somatic level, on an energetic level, and an emotional level, where they're observant and aware of all of the different states of being that their herd members are occupying in that moment. And the trust is like a spider web of information. The trust is formed through a communication, a superhighway, if you like, between all of those members of the herd that are communicating with each other in order that they can maintain a cohesive sense of safety, right? So if one member of the herd decides that for some reason there's cause for alarm, that will be communicated through the ranks, and the entire herd will move as one creature in order to move themselves towards a safe space or a safe place. So if we think about what happens when we combine the two experiences of trust together, we have the human experience of trust, which is you either have it or you don't, or I'm sitting in this tangential place where I'm deciding whether or not you're worthy of my trust. And we have this equine version of trust, which is a constant communication of safety and understanding that informs my present moment, and as a consequence also informs the actions that I take next. Yeah, and if you combine those two things together, you can see how problems could arise, in that I might be stepping out into the arena and saying, I don't trust you, or what you did yesterday shows me that you're not worthy of my trust. So until you show me that you are indeed worthy of my trust, I will not extend trust to you. And then if you think about on a visceral level what that feels like to be on the other side of not receiving trust, there's an alarm that goes off, yeah? A sense of threat, if you like, that comes off the back of that I believe is tangibly communicated to our horses. And so on the other side, we have our horses who are looking to us to see whether their needs are being met, whether there is a feeling of safety, a palpable feeling of safety, whether what they communicate is being listened to, whether we are able to actually drop into a place where we're having a conversation between us rather than this is how this should be and I'm going to force you into this place, for instance. And when those needs aren't being met from their side, when there is a concern that perhaps this is not going to be taken up in the way that we need it taken up, then they communicate a lack of trust to us through a behavioural issue or challenge, through shutting down perhaps, through feeling anxious, so many different forms of how that might show up. And then we in turn transfer onto them this very polarized understanding of trust and feel like, well, I can't trust you yet. And so we get involved in this vicious cycle of kind of chasing our tails. And the trust is never going to be felt because we're not communicating on the same platform. Yeah, we're not actually engaging in a conversation that has both of us speaking the same language. So when it comes to confidence, or when it comes to thinking about trust with your horse, what I would invite you to do is to step into a slightly different way of being, a different way of perceiving, to have a new conversation that involves you having the courage to actually drop the one you've constantly been participating in prior, and to ask yourself, what does my horse need from me in order to feel safe in this situation, in order to feel like I'm on his team or her team? Yeah. And the deeper question, or the more beautiful question that rises off the back of this, I believe, is how can I trust myself to be able to follow my own inner wisdom, to be able to access the skills that I have, to be able to tap into my intuition and instincts, so that I'm not compromising either of us as we move through this work together. So this trust conversation is not as simplistic as we make it. It's not about, can I trust you or can't I, or do I sit in this medium space? It's, do I trust myself? Do I trust myself enough to know when to take the next step, when to wait, or when to draw back? Yeah. And do I have what is needed for my horse to feel like the dynamic communication that's existing between both of us is enough for them to understand that they're okay, that there is a safe container that's kind of caressing them in this moment. And from that place, we can continue this meandering together, if you like. You know, there's no neat box to put this in. And I just think this waiting for trust, this constant waiting for trust, really holds us back, because in many instances, the criteria that we're waiting to be filled is never going to be filled. It relates more to a feeling of a lack of self-trust rather than what it is that we are dealing with on the outside. And if we can get to that place, if we can actually tap into that deeper place, that scarier place, you know, the place where we have to rely on what we think and what we want and what we know, then we can be liberated from these kind of very fixed ideas about what trust might be. Those are my musings for today. I have a very loud bee or fly in the background. And I'm going to use them as an indication that it's time to wrap up. But I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. And maybe for you to kind of take this with you as you work with your horse and think about trust as a dynamic experience. And that if you can extend trust to yourself, then you can start to practice permeable and adaptable boundaries that will allow you to recognize, like I said, when to keep going, when to draw back, or when you're in a waiting period.